For context, I reside in a tranquil neighborhood characterized by spacious properties, typically spanning 2 to 3 acres each. During the incident I'm about to recount, my wife was away, leaving me alone at home after I finished mowing the lawn. As I checked my phone, I noticed a text from an unfamiliar number, claiming to be from Craigslist and asking if they could visit. Now, I had never used Craigslist, and I doubted my wife had either. I replied, informing them they had the wrong number, and that I didn't use Craigslist. However, their response, containing my exact address, unnerved me. They followed up with, "This is your address," right? I was perplexed and chose not to respond, hoping it was some sort of prank. Several hours later, I received another message from the same number, asking if they could come over. I promptly replied, declining their request and stating that I had nothing for sale. Hours passed before I received another message around 10 o'clock, simply stating, "I'm here." This message sent shivers down my spine. Curious and cautious, I moved to the living room and peered out the window, but the darkness of the night obscured my view. I didn't see any cars in my driveway or on the road. Returning to the family room, which adjoined the living room, I sat down on the couch. Moments later, I received another text instructing me to check the front window. With a sense of dread, I complied and stepped into the living room. There, standing outside the window, was a man staring at me with wide, unsettling eyes. I didn't recognize him at all. In a panic, I dialed the police. The man remained motionless for a minute before suddenly darting away. By the time the police arrived, he had vanished. After blocking the number and ensuring my safety, I remained vigilant, checking the front window repeatedly, but he never returned. To this day, the incident remains a mystery. How did he obtain my address, and who was he? I have no answers. "Okay, I've got a story for you," I began, excitement lacing my voice. "I'll never forget the time I went on Craigslist to find a vintage rocking chair. I've always been into antique furniture, and when I saw this amazing mahogany chair with these insane carvings, I just knew I had to have it. So I messaged the seller, and we agreed to meet up at their place the next day. I was pretty pumped about it," I continued, recalling the eagerness I felt. Anyway, the next day I grabbed the cash and drove to the seller's house. The address led me to this sketchy-looking neighborhood, which was a bit unsettling, but I told myself not to judge a book by its cover. When I arrived, the house was old and looked like it hadn't been taken care of in years. I started having second thoughts, but my desire for that rocking chair pushed me to go on, I explained, a sense of unease creeping in. So I walked up to the front door and knocked. The door slowly creaked open, and there was this shadowy figure just standing there, motioning for me to come in. I hesitated for a sec, but then went inside, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I recounted, the memory sending shivers down my spine. The inside of the house was even creepier. It was dark and smelled like mildew, and there were all these old, dusty pieces of furniture and cobwebs everywhere. The seller led me through this labyrinth of rooms, and the further we went, the more I started to freak out. But I just kept telling myself that it was all in my head. I continued, my heart racing with each step. We finally got to this room in the back of the house, and there it was, the rocking chair I'd seen in the ad. It looked just as amazing as it did in the photos, and for a moment, I felt relieved. I went up to inspect the chair, excited to take it home. I handed the seller the cash, and they said they'd help me carry it to my car, I said, recalling the tense atmosphere. As we were heading back to the house, I noticed that a door we passed earlier that had been locked was now slightly open. I could hear these faint, desperate cries coming from inside, and I felt chills running down my spine. I glanced at the seller, who seemed to be getting more and more nervous, and my heart started pounding like crazy. I confessed, the memory still vivid in my mind. I knew I had to get out of there, so I pretended that I got an emergency phone call and told the seller I had to leave right away, but to come back for the chair later. The seller hesitated, then finally agreed. I practically sprinted out of the house, my heart pounding so hard I could hardly breathe. I recalled, the panic still fresh. Once I was safe in my car, I sped off to the nearest police station. I told them everything that had happened, my hands shaking the whole time. The police acted quickly and launched an investigation. It turned out that the seller had kidnapped someone and was holding them captive in that room. I revealed, the shock still evident in my voice. I couldn't believe how close I'd come to a truly terrifying situation. The police were able to save the person being held captive, and the seller was arrested. They had a long criminal record, including theft and assault. I can't even imagine what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts and gotten out of there when I did, I admitted, a shiver running down my spine at the thought. My friends and family were shocked when they heard my story. They couldn't believe something like this could happen to someone they knew. I became a lot more cautious after that, always making sure to trust my gut and put safety first. As for the rocking chair, well, I never went back for it, I concluded, the memory still haunting me. The thought of going back to that house, even with the police involved, was too much for me to handle. Eventually, I found another antique chair from a reliable seller, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Now, whenever I browse Craigslist or other online marketplaces, that eerie encounter is always at the back of my mind. I still can't help but shudder to think about the children's cries behind that door and the dark, musty house I admitted. The horror of the situation still raw. As for the rocking chair, it has become a symbol of that fateful night. Even now, sometimes in the dead of night, I can't help but wonder what other sinister secrets that house and its twisted occupant might have been hiding. One time, years ago, I was in the market for a TV and decided to browse Craigslist. I often found great deals or even free items there, although caution was always necessary. Upon discovering a promising ad for a reasonably priced TV, I reached out to the seller, expressing my interest in purchasing it. Within an hour, I received a response from a woman named Joy, confirming that the TV was still available. She provided an address and instructed me to come over the following night to make the purchase. The address seemed to be in a nearby neighborhood, so the next day, I prepared the cash and headed there. Arriving around 7 p.m., I parked in front of the house, situated in what seemed like an average neighborhood. When I knocked on the door, it was swiftly answered by a woman in her 30s with dark hair. She welcomed me inside, apologizing for the mess of boxes strewn around the living room. Joy mentioned that the TV was in her bedroom and led me down the hallway. Opening the bedroom door, she gestured for me to enter. However, upon stepping inside, I realized the room was empty. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, locking me in. It all happened so fast Joy hadn't even entered the room. I attempted to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. Confusion and panic set in as I knocked and called out to Joy, but received no response. After several futile minutes, I accepted that I was trapped. With no furniture in the room, I was left alone in an eerie silence, wondering what was happening outside the locked door. I grabbed my phone and attempted to call my friend, but I couldn't get a signal. That seemed strange. Trying to open the door and calling for help yielded no response. It became evident that nobody was coming to my aid. Puzzled and anxious, I scanned the room, wondering what was happening. After several minutes, I heard noises emanating from outside the room, seemingly from the living room area. It was Joy and a man conversing, although I couldn't discern their words. Despite yelling out, I received no reply. Frustrated, I tried to open the window, but it wouldn't budge, further fueling my anger. Returning to the door, I pounded on it fiercely, desperate to break it down. Suddenly, a man's voice from down the hallway shouted at me to stop. Unsure of what these people were capable of, I hesitated briefly before taking action. Retrieving my phone, I turned up the volume and played the most annoying alarm noise, placing it at the far end of the room. Concealing myself behind the door, I waited. Within moments, footsteps approached the room, and the door swung open, revealing the man. As he moved towards the noisy phone, I emerged from my hiding spot, darting past him and fleeing the room. He attempted to grab me, but I narrowly evaded his grasp. Racing down the hallway, I encountered Joy in the living room, who tried to impede my progress. Dodging past her, I reached the door, with the man now in pursuit. Swiftly unlocking my car, I jumped inside and sped away. Unfortunately, I had left my phone behind, rendering me unable to call the police immediately. Stopping at the nearest gas station, I entered and asked the employee to contact the authorities. When they arrived, we returned to the house, where my phone was found abandoned on the street nearby. The perpetrators were nowhere to be seen, and it was revealed that they didn't actually reside in the home. It was rented by someone else. Unsure if they were ever apprehended, I discovered that the Craigslist post had been removed. After that harrowing experience, I vowed never to use Craigslist again. I was on Craigslist for the first time in probably 5 years. I thought to myself, realizing I'd forgotten about the site. I'd never had any need or use for it and hadn't really heard about it lately. But due to my moving situation, I needed to get rid of a bunch of random things. I initially called a junk removal company, hoping they would just take everything. However, their estimate was over $400 for getting rid of just a couple of things. That's when I turned to Craigslist. I put up a listing for free stuff and included pictures of all the things I was giving away. Maybe I just didn't understand how it works nowadays, but I thought I'd get a lot of responses from people wanting to pick up free stuff. However, I barely got any, and the ones that did respond to the listing ended up ghosting me after a couple of texts. Then, about a week after making the listing, a man who introduced himself as KJ reached out. He said he wanted to pick up my couch and was flexible about the day. I really thought this was going to be the same as all the other people who had reached out, so I didn't put much effort into getting him to actually come pick up the couch. I let him know that I worked between 9 and 5, so if he wanted to pick it up, he could just let me know. Again, I didn't think he'd actually come. But sure enough, in the morning before work, he sent me a text saying he'd like to swing by tonight. I told him that was great, I said, expressing my approval. As I left work that night, I sent him my address. The drive home was only about 20 minutes, but I hoped he would come sooner rather than later because I didn't want to waste my night waiting for him. So if he didn't end up showing, I could do something else. When I pulled into my driveway, a car was parked on the curb right next to my house, but nobody was in it. It was the only car parked on the whole street, so it seemed clear that they were at my house. Thinking it was KJ, I quickly got out and ran to my front door, but he wasn't there. It crossed my mind that this could be just some crazy coincidence, and the car might be for someone else's house, but I wasn't convinced. I got inside and sent a text to KJ asking what his ETA was. Then I stood by the window and looked outside. After 10 or so minutes, I still hadn't gotten a response, and I didn't see anyone outside either. So I calmed myself down and turned away from the window. I went to the kitchen, pouring myself a drink and just standing there when a small thud sounded from upstairs. Unaware of what it was, I put my drink down and listened. There were a few seconds of silence. Then suddenly, heavy footsteps were running down the stairs. I was so caught off guard. I just stood where I was and stared down the hallway as a man appeared at the other end, running right to the front door. He swung it open and ran out. And when I made it to the front, he was already driving away in that car that was parked on the curb. I was still stunned, trying to process what happened, because it was all so sudden and quick. Eventually, I got my phone out and called the police, then tried calling KJ, but he didn't pick up, which meant to me that it was definitely him who had broken in. When the police investigated, they found that KJ's phone wasn't registered to a name or address. So we were back to square one. Nothing ever did come of it, despite me trying multiple times to get the police back on the case. As far as I know, nothing was stolen. So maybe he didn't have enough time, or he was waiting for me. Maybe that thud I heard was him accidentally giving himself away. So he took his chance to run now that he didn't have the element of surprise on me. But whatever really happened, all I can do is hope that he never comes back. Roughly 2 years ago, I decided to sell my old phone on Craigslist after upgrading to a new one. The phone was only 2 years old and in good condition, so I thought it would attract buyers. After considering eBay, Facebook Marketplace, and Craigslist, I opted for the latter, prioritizing a quick sale over making a profit. Listing the phone at a reasonable price, I received a text message expressing interest within a few hours. The potential buyer, Molly, seemed eager, so we arranged to meet the following day outside a local strip mall, conveniently located for both of us. When we met, the transaction went smoothly, and Molly purchased the phone without any issues. Everything appeared normal during our brief interaction, and there were no red flags. However, things took a strange turn in the days that followed. Molly began texting me, initially asking me to come over, and then inquiring if she could visit my place. It was unexpected and out of context, considering our interaction had been solely about the phone sale. At first I wondered if she had the wrong number, but then she mentioned my name, indicating she was indeed contacting me intentionally. I had no interest in pursuing any further interaction with Molly beyond the sale, and her persistent texts, which continued late into the night and into the next morning, left me feeling uncomfortable and confused. Once again, Molly persisted in her attempts to come over, ignoring my previous attempts to deter her. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I lied and told her I had a girlfriend, hoping she would take the hint and leave me alone. However, Molly disregarded my statement, insisting it didn't matter, and continued texting me as if we were close friends, asking about my activities. Feeling bewildered by her behavior, I asked her to stop, but she became angry and started hurling insults at me. Frustrated and alarmed, I decided to block her, hoping to put an end to the unsettling situation. Little did I know, the ordeal was far from over. Later that same night, I heard a knock at my front door. Peering through the window, I was stunned to see Molly standing outside. How did she find out where I lived? It was alarming to think she might have followed me home. Reluctantly, I answered the door, intending to firmly tell her to leave. However, as soon as I opened the door, Molly launched into a tirade of curses and refused to leave. Growing increasingly aggressive, she attempted to enter my house. In a panic, I slammed the door shut and locked it, but she persisted, banging on windows and trying to force her way inside. Realizing I needed help, I called the police and waited inside. Molly continued her relentless assault on my home, banging on windows and attempting to open doors. Even when I tried to reason with her through a window, she remained undeterred. Thankfully, the police arrived and were able to intervene, putting an end to Molly's alarming behavior. Subsequently, I obtained a restraining order against her, as I couldn't comprehend why she fixated on me so intensely. I suspected drugs might be involved, but I couldn't say for sure. This experience served as a stark reminder to exercise caution when using platforms like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. At 23, I was on the hunt for a studio apartment to rent. Fresh out of college, I had next to no money, barely scraping by on a bit more than minimum wage. My primary focus was finding the cheapest possible option available. Initially, I searched for both one-bedroom apartments and studios. However, as the weeks went by, it became increasingly clear that those options were simply not financially feasible. Reluctantly, I turned to Craigslist, despite its less than stellar reputation. One of my friends had a positive experience and recommended it, so I decided to give it a shot. On the first day of browsing Craigslist, I didn't come across anything suitable, though the sheer volume of listings gave me a glimmer of hope. Unfortunately, none of them matched my location or price requirements. It was around the third or fourth day of searching that I stumbled upon a new listing that caught my attention. Located a few miles away, it was for a studio in a small apartment building. Despite the low-quality, pixelated pictures, I decided to investigate further, intrigued by the promising details. I reached out to the owner, who responded promptly, and we arranged a tour for later that evening at 7. In our brief exchange, nothing struck me as out of the ordinary about the owner. His messages were professional, and he appeared eager to show me the place. A couple of hours later, I got into my car and started driving over to the address he sent me. It's worth noting that I was aware beforehand that this wasn't a particularly nice area of our city, but it was the most affordable. Honestly, I didn't think it was too bad, although looking back, perhaps I was just being naive because it seemed like my only option. Upon arriving, I pulled up to a rather old-looking apartment building. Parking on the side of the street, I texted the man to let him know I had arrived, then proceeded to walk up to the front door. Not spotting the man anywhere, I buzzed the room and waited for a few seconds before the door unlocked. Stepping inside, I was greeted by a staircase in the middle and 2 rooms on either side. Before I could even glance at the room numbers, a voice echoed from somewhere above the staircase, informing me that they were on the 3rd floor. Assuming the man was addressing me, I began ascending the stairs. However, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease at his absence from the door, especially considering how professional he had been in our text exchanges. Upon reaching the top of the steps, I found myself in a small hallway with 2 doors, one of which was open. I walked over and peered inside, only to find a man standing a few feet away, looking back at me. He greeted me warmly, shook my hand, and invited me inside. Yet my confusion was immediate. The place was clearly inhabited, with a couch, TV, chairs, and even food on the counters. It was unmistakably lived in. "Does someone else live here?" I asked kindly. The man quickly replied with a short laugh and said, "No one lived here and everything would be gone by tomorrow." I smiled and said, "Okay, though that response didn't sit right with me." He started leading me further in, pointing out features of the place. But it suddenly dawned on me that this wasn't even a studio. There were multiple doors, surely leading to other rooms. This was at least a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And there was no way the price could be what he said it was. It seemed like he noticed my suspicions as he stopped what he was saying and moved toward the hallway. He opened one of the doors that clearly led to a bedroom and started telling me to take a look inside. But before I could answer, we were interrupted when my phone chimed. I pulled it out of my pocket and checked who it was. My face went pale, seeing it was from the man from Craigslist asking where I was. I looked up in horror, realizing what had happened, and I could tell that whoever this guy was in front of me knew that I'd figured it out. This terrifying moment passed, and the guy didn't move or say anything. He just stood and looked at me with a blank stare. After a moment, I hurried out of there and down the stairs, not hearing the guy follow. I got in my car and left, feeling horrified. I never even texted the actual man back, as I was no longer interested in staying anywhere near that place. And I didn't know if maybe he was in on it too, somehow. But whoever that guy was who lured me into his home was so close to being able to probably abduct me. I don't know. And I don't even want to know. But I never opened Craigslist again after that night. I have a Craigslist horror story that I'd like to share, serving as a cautionary tale for those using such websites. A few years ago, I was selling my old MacBook Pro laptop. It was still fairly new, and since I had received a new one from work, I decided to put it up for sale on Craigslist for $1,000. It was a reasonable price considering its condition and value. Within 24 hours of posting the ad, I received a text from someone expressing interest in buying the laptop. I confirmed the price of $1,000 and suggested meeting in a public place for safety reasons. The person proposed Walmart, which seemed like a reasonable choice due to its high visibility and foot traffic. However, what raised a red flag was the person's insistence on meeting at 10 p.m. or later, claiming they worked overnight shifts. Despite my reservations, I agreed to the meeting time. When I asked for their name, they identified themselves as Derek, providing only a vague description of being of average height with dark hair. Despite the uncertainty, we settled on meeting at 10:15 p.m. the following night at Walmart. Arriving shortly after 10 p.m., I parked in the middle of the parking lot, which by then was eerily quiet as the store was set to close at 11 p.m. I believe I texted Derek to let him know that I was at the agreed meeting spot. However, he didn't respond for a while, leaving me waiting and growing increasingly frustrated. It wasn't until around 10:30 p.m. that he finally replied, informing me that he would arrive in about 15 minutes. Despite my annoyance, I decided to wait patiently, hoping that selling the laptop would make it worth the wait. As time ticked by and it approached 11 p.m., I was on the verge of leaving when Derek finally texted me, claiming he had arrived and was at the back of the parking lot. Scanning the area, I couldn't spot him from where I was parked, eager to conclude the transaction. I drove towards the rear of the parking lot, where several cars were scattered randomly. Unsure which one belonged to Derek, I parked in a random spot and asked him again for his location. With no immediate response from Derek, I suddenly spotted a car approaching. Assuming it was him, I watched as it drew nearer, only to realize that the driver and passengers were all wearing black ski masks. Sensing danger, I swiftly drove away, prompting the car to follow me briefly. However, as we reached the front of the parking lot, I noticed a police car stationed there. Seizing the opportunity, I drove towards the police car, prompting the car behind me to make a hasty U-turn in the narrow parking island. Thankfully, the ploy worked, and the suspicious individuals disappeared. Relieved, I drove home and promptly blocked Derek's number. Subsequently, I removed my laptop from Craigslist and opted to list it on eBay instead. That night changed everything. Now every shadow holds their sinister secrets. In 2018, I experienced a divorce that left me with virtually nothing. I relocated to a small home, but it was empty. I lacked furniture, appliances, everything, really. The task of furnishing my place seemed daunting, particularly from a financial standpoint. So I saw this as an opportunity to find discounted items on Craigslist. My main focus was on big-ticket items like a couch and a TV. Finding deals didn't prove difficult. I reached out to a few sellers and made some purchases. During this process, I came across a listing for a TV stand posted for $40. It looked like a typical wooden TV stand. The seller, Matt, however, had specific conditions for pickup. He insisted it had to be after 9 on weekdays due to his work schedule, ruling out weekends entirely. While this arrangement still suited me, I found his strictness somewhat peculiar. I assumed this specificity was why the item hadn't been sold yet. I agreed to pick up the TV stand on a Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. On the appointed day, I confirmed with Matt and received his address. The town he lived in was unfamiliar to me, only mentioned in passing conversations. Soon I understood why. Most of the homes were dilapidated, with aging infrastructure. Even the streetlights were mostly non-functional. Pulling up to Matt's house didn't ease my unease. It matched the rundown appearance of the surrounding homes, illuminated only by a dim hallway light. I counted out $40 and tucked the bills into my pocket before stepping out of my car and onto his porch. As I waited for him to answer the doorbell, I glanced around his yard. It was cluttered with various items, garden statues, eclectic decorations scattered about. The porch itself was adorned with knickknacks and oddities. Then he opened the door. Matt was a tall and skinnier-looking man, probably in his 40s I observed. He wore a tired expression, as if he hadn't slept in days. As he welcomed me inside, I could smell booze on his breath. If I'd known beforehand that this was who I'd be buying from, I never even would have come here, I thought, but it was too late for that now. As we walked down the hall, stuff was scattered all around the house. It wasn't like a hoarder's home you'd see on TV, but more like an abandoned house that had been trashed by random teenagers. When we reached the living room in the back of the house, he pointed at the TV stand. The room was barely lit, making it hard to see the condition it was in. "Any chance you could turn on the light for me?" I asked politely. Matt didn't respond, but walked over to the wall and flicked on a small lamp in the corner. It was around this time that I got a really weird feeling that something was wrong. And before I even got to look at the TV stand, I heard someone else behind me. Another man had come around the corner, standing next to Matt. He didn't say hello or anything, just watched me. I was really unsure what to make of this and didn't want to overreact right away, but I was also getting really uncomfortable as that eerie feeling only grew larger. I was standing there trying to think of what to say or do, but then Matt walked past me and stood in front of the TV stand. They were now on either side of me, facing me and not speaking. Several long seconds passed as nobody spoke or moved. Before I quickly walked past the other guy and down the hallway toward the front door, I made a hasty exit. As I left, I heard them laughing in the room behind me, like this was funny, and as I got halfway to my car, the front doors slammed shut. I can't even find any reasons for what occurred that night or what those two guys were trying to do. Maybe it was just some sick joke they were pulling, trying to get me to freak out, or maybe it was something more sinister. I don't plan on finding out though. I have this crazy story about the time I sold my old gaming console on Craigslist. I began, excitement tingling in my voice. I had upgraded to a newer version and figured I could make some cash by selling the old one. I put up an ad with photos and all the details, and within a few hours, I got a message from someone who was interested. The buyer seemed normal enough, so we agreed to meet up at a coffee shop the next day. I continued, recalling the events vividly. I thought it would be a quick and easy exchange, but man was I wrong. The next day I got to the coffee shop a bit early and gravitated to the window. I had my gaming console all packed up and ready to go, and I kept checking my phone to make sure I hadn't missed any messages from the buyer. I explained, feeling a sense of anticipation building. Right on time, this guy walked in and I could tell he was the one I had been messaging. He had this intense stare and seemed eager to get the console. I recounted, the memory sending a shiver down my spine. As he sat down, I noticed he seemed really jumpy, like he was on edge. He didn't make any small talk, just asked to see the console right away. I obliged, unpacking it and showing him everything that was included. But I noticed he kept glancing around nervously, as if he was expecting someone to jump out at him. I said, my unease growing with each passing moment. It was a bit unnerving, but I figured he was just an anxious person. After he seemed satisfied with the console, he pulled out a thick wad of cash and started counting it out on the table. He didn't even try to hide it, just plopped it down for everyone to see. I recalled, feeling uncomfortable at the memory. I could tell other people in the coffee shop were staring at us. I quickly grabbed the money and counted it, stuffing it in my pocket. Then he started asking me a bunch of weird questions, like if I had any other gaming systems or valuable electronics at home. I continued, my voice growing tense. I tried to brush off the questions without giving away too much information, but it was clear he was trying to pry into my personal life. The more questions he asked, the more uneasy I felt. There was something off about this guy, but I didn't know what to do, I admitted, feeling a knot form in my stomach. When we finally finished the transaction, I packed up the console and handed it over to him. As he got up to leave, he gave me this chilling grin and said he hoped to do business with me again soon. I forced a smile and nodded, just wanting to put the whole thing behind me, I confessed, the memory still sending shivers down my spine. But as I watched him walk away, I couldn't help but feel like I just made a huge mistake. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the encounter in my head, wondering if I'd given away too much information about myself. I continued, my voice trembling slightly. I became paranoid, constantly checking my locks and peering out my windows, half expecting to see the creepy buyer lurking outside. Then one night, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a picture of my house taken from across the street, with a message, "Nice place you got there," I recounted, the fear evident in my voice. My heart dropped, and I felt sick to my stomach. This guy had somehow found out where I lived and was now stalking me. I didn't know what to do, so I called the police and reported the incident, I said, relief flooding through me as I recalled their swift response. The police opened an investigation and suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a few days. They also advised me to keep an eye on my online presence and be cautious about the information I shared. I took their advice and stayed with a friend for a while, terrified of what might happen next, I admitted, feeling a sense of vulnerability wash over me. The police eventually got in touch with me and told me that they had identified the guy from the coffee shop. It turned out he had a history of stalking and harassment, and he had targeted several other people who had sold items to him through Craigslist. They were able to apprehend him and press charges, which gave me some relief, I said, gratitude coloring my voice. But it didn't completely erase the fear that had taken root in my mind. During the investigation, the police discovered that he had been living in a rundown apartment filled with stolen goods and surveillance equipment. I revealed, the horror of the situation sinking in. He had been monitoring his victims for months, learning their routines and gathering information about their lives. I couldn't believe how close I'd come to becoming one of his victims and how easily he had been able to infiltrate my life, I confessed, a shiver running down my spine at the thought. My friends and family were shocked by the whole ordeal. They couldn't believe that something so terrifying had happened to someone they knew. Even now, years later, the memory of that creepy buyer and his chilling grin still haunts me, I admitted, the fear still lingering in the depths of my mind. This happened about 3 months ago. My roommate and I decided on getting a used couch, so I thought Craigslist would be a great place for used furniture. I scrolled through about 3 pages before finding a black leather couch. It was in really good condition and had a really good price, around $200. I told myself this was too good to be true. And man, I should have listened to myself. We arranged a price, and the guy told me to meet him at his place over email. My roommate was out working overtime, so I had to go alone. The address was a little ways out of town. The house was surrounded by trees. You had to go through the drive-thru to be able to see it. I got out of my car and knocked on the door. This house was different. It was small and wooden and looked pretty eerie. When I knocked the third time, I heard creaks on the wood floor coming from inside. Anyone could tell it was footsteps, but it sounded like they were tiptoeing. Then I heard a faint, muffled voice through the door. "Hey, are you the couch guy?" But they sounded pretty rushed. So I responded, yes, I am. He said back, "Okay, come around back. The couch is there." I felt a little weirded out by it, but I brushed it off. When I came around back, I saw something that I won't forget. I saw 4 tall men dressed in black robes with their hands together, and in front of them was a pit with a hatchet chain on it. Then I heard the same voice say, "Where's your friend?" I booked it out of there and frantically shoved the key in my car and started it. I looked out the mirror and saw the front door fly open. I shifted into first and floored it out of there. The thing that makes me uneasy to this day is that in the emails, I never told him I had a roommate. Last year I attempted to sell my 2007 Mercury Mariner, which was in pretty good shape despite having a lot of miles and being rather old. Nonetheless, it ran very well and was a reliable car. Opting to list it on Craigslist due to previous positive experiences buying cars there, I took several pictures of the vehicle and posted the ad. On the second day, I received a text message response from a man named Owl, expressing interest in purchasing the car. He appeared confident about it from the start, and since I had set a reasonable price, I provided him with my address for a viewing. Living in an apartment building, I didn't perceive any risk in sharing my address, as the complex had multiple buildings, making it unlikely for Owl to determine which apartment was mine. We arranged for him to visit the following day after his work at 9 p.m. Preparing the car for the viewing, I cleaned it out in anticipation of the potential sale. When the appointed time arrived, I left my apartment and headed to the parking lot, where Owl soon parked nearby. He emerged from his vehicle, a burly man adorned with numerous tattoos, standing about 6 feet tall and weighing around 250 pounds. After introductions, I showcased the Mariner to him, and he inspected it thoroughly. Following a brief period, Owl expressed interest in taking it for a test drive. Accompanying him, we drove around the block and nearby streets. He conveyed satisfaction with the vehicle, leading me to believe a sale was imminent. Upon returning to the apartment complex and parking the car in its original spot, Owl unexpectedly announced that he needed more time to consider the purchase. Disappointed by the sudden turn of events, I reluctantly bid him farewell. As we parted ways, Owl surprised me by asking if he could use my bathroom quickly. This seemed sketchy, I thought to myself. Why did he think it would be okay with me for him to use my bathroom? I voiced my concern, saying no to his request, and started walking away. The situation felt suspicious, and I was afraid it might be some sort of setup. I definitely didn't want this guy coming into my apartment. He lingered around by my car, and although my apartment building had both a side door and a front door, I decided to head towards the front. I left him standing there and made my way inside. There was a slight fear that he might follow me, but when I glanced back upon reaching the front doors, he was nowhere in sight. This reassured me, and I entered the building. Once inside, I turned right and entered the elevator, taking it up to the 3rd floor where my apartment was located. Stepping off, I started walking to the left, but then I spotted him entering the hallway from the door, at the end, leading to a stairwell. What on earth was he doing here? Initially moving towards my door, I saw him heading in my direction. I quickly changed course, turning and walking the other way. Suddenly, I heard him start running towards me, prompting me to sprint to the end of the hallway. As I reached it, I darted into the stairs on the opposite side and descended. With Owl in pursuit, I made my way into the underground parking garage beneath the building. Racing across it to the far end, I managed to gain some distance. Despite this, I could still hear him chasing after me. Reaching the stairs on the other side, I ran up to ground level and exited through the side door. Once outside, I hurried to my car, got inside, and drove away. Calling the police as I left, I informed them about the situation. After circling the nearby streets for a few minutes, I returned. Owl's car was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. The police arrived shortly after, and I didn't re-enter the building until they did. To my surprise, they discovered Owl attempting to break into another apartment. It became apparent that he had never been interested in buying my car. He was likely planning to rob me or worse. I was just a regular guy trying to sell my motorbike on Craigslist. It was a beautiful shiny black Yamaha R6 that I'd had for a couple of years. I had some great times on that bike, but I needed the cash for other things. I put it up for sale and soon got a few inquiries, but nothing too promising. Then, one day, a guy named Jim sent me a message. Jim was eager to buy the bike and asked if we could meet up the very next day. I agreed, and we set a location and time. I couldn't help but feel excited about the prospect of finally selling the bike and moving on. Little did I know, this excitement would soon turn into a horrifying experience. The day arrived and I waited for Jim in a public parking lot. It was an overcast day, with the sun struggling to break through the heavy clouds. The atmosphere was tense, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, it was just a simple transaction, right? Finally, Jim showed up. He was a tall, lanky guy with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but maybe that was just his style. I couldn't help but feel a little on edge, but I tried to brush it off as just nerves. He checked out the bike, and everything seemed to be going well. After a thorough inspection, Jim asked if he could take the bike for a test ride. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision in my gut. I didn't want to be too trusting, but I also didn't want to ruin the sale by being paranoid. So I agreed to the test ride, but only if Jim handed over his driver's license as collateral. He agreed without hesitation and handed me the license. It looked real enough, and his picture matched the face in front of me. With that, Jim got on the bike and took off, leaving me standing there with his license in hand. I waited and waited, each minute feeling heavier than the last. The sun started to dip behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I paced back and forth, trying to remain calm. But the longer I waited, the more my anxiety grew. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. As the wait stretched on, I realized that something was wrong. It shouldn't have taken this long for a test ride. With a sinking feeling, I looked at the driver's license again. And that's when I noticed it. The small details that just didn't add up. The font was slightly off. The texture of the card felt weird, and the holographic image didn't shimmer like it should. The license was fake. My heart raced and my palms were clammy. I said aloud to myself, I had just let a complete stranger ride off with my precious motorbike, and I had nothing but a useless piece of plastic to show for it. I felt like a complete idiot and knew that I had to act fast if I wanted any chance of getting my bike back. Thankfully, I had installed a GPS tracker on the bike just a few months earlier. It was a small hidden device that I'd almost forgotten about. In a frenzy, I pulled out my phone to access the tracking app. To my relief, the tracker was still functioning, and I could see the bike's location in real time. It was miles away from where we had met, in a sketchy part of town that I would try to avoid. My heart sank even further, but I knew what I had to do. I immediately called the police and explained the situation. They asked for the details of the bike, the buyer, and the location of the tracker. I provided everything, hoping that they would be able to help me. The officer on the phone told me to stay put and wait for their arrival, but I could barely contain my restlessness. As I waited, the minutes felt like hours. Every second that ticked by, I imagined the worst happening to my bike, stripped for parts, damaged beyond repair, or simply disappearing forever. I couldn't stand it any longer. And despite the officer's instructions, I decided to drive towards the location of the tracker. As I drove to the sketchy part of town, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I navigated the unfamiliar streets, trying to follow the signal from the tracker. My heart pounded in my chest, and every cell in my body screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to find my bike. Finally, I arrived at an old, run-down warehouse. The tracker showed that my bike was inside a parked car a few streets away. I walked to the warehouse, my heart pounding in my ears. The area was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the gravel crunching under my feet. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should wait for the police. But the thought of my bike being destroyed or stolen was too much. I had to see it with my own eyes. I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and slowly pushed the rusty door open. The warehouse was dark and musty, with only a few slivers of light filtering in through the broken windows. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I scanned the room, my heart racing. And there, in the far corner, I saw my beloved motorbike, partially hidden behind some old crates. I rushed over to it, and as I got closer, I could see that it was still in one piece. It seemed untouched, almost as if the thief had just abandoned it there. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I quickly checked the bike for any signs of damage, and finding none, decided to wheel it out of the warehouse and back to my car. As I made my way out of the warehouse, I heard sirens approaching in the distance. The police had finally arrived, and I met them outside, my heart still pounding, but now with a mixture of relief and gratitude. I explained what had happened and how I found the bike. The officers took down my statement and assured me that they would investigate the matter further. They told me I was lucky to have installed the tracker, as it had probably saved my bike from being lost forever. After everything had calmed down, I loaded the bike onto my car and drove back home. I couldn't believe what I had just been through. The experience had been a roller coaster of emotions, from excitement to dread to relief. It was a lesson in trust, and a reminder to always be cautious when dealing with random strangers online. I was about 12 years old, looking for some craft storage since I got a lot for Christmas. The ones at the stores were really pricey. So my 27-year-old sister and I looked for someone on Craigslist. We found someone offering a huge tote for only $10. That would mean getting a $90 discount. So we checked it out. The person lived relatively close to us. We gave the guy our email. He emailed us within an hour and asked where we should meet. I suggested we should meet at Dollar Tree since it was a short walk away. To my surprise, he asked to meet at my home. I lived in an apartment, so that would be inconvenient. So I said that we lived farther away. He said he could drive, but we declined. Eventually, we said it was okay to meet at Dollar Tree. But he could only meet up at 9 p.m. I said that's okay, even though it would be dark by then. He said to meet up today. My sister worked the night shift tonight, so she said I could walk there and back and to just bring my wagon so I could put the tote in it. She gave me $10 and I started walking at 8:30. I arrived just on time and I saw an old knocked-up 2006 Kia. I assumed it was him. So I yelled, "Hey," got the tote he got out of his car and said he left it at home. He asked if I wanted to take a drive with him to his house. I said I can't because it wasn't okay with my family. He said he would drive me home, and I firmly said no. He said if I came with him that I could get the tote for free. I got a very uneasy feeling. He said, "Hey, your address is 234 Letter Road, right?" My heart dropped into my stomach. I got freaked out and ran all the way home. I got home and ran upstairs like a demon was chasing me. I got to my room and locked all the doors and windows. I also covered them with black clothing and such. That night I was shaking like crazy. And then I heard a hefty man coming up the stairs. Almost no one on my floor was up that late. And no hefty men lived there. I heard a voice and I almost fainted. "Hey, you still want that tote? It's done in my car. Come help me get it." I almost puked and fainted. I looked through the peephole to see the man's back facing my door. I watched him turn around. When I covered the peephole with a black shirt I had laying around from before, the doorknob started to wiggle. I went under the sink cabinet and was silent as a worm. He started to try to kick the door down, and eventually he did. I felt like I was ready to die. I grabbed an old broom that was sitting in the cabinet. The kicking down of the door woke up my neighbors, who came running in with a baseball bat. My neighbor whacked the guy in the face with the bat, and the guy fell to the floor. I got out with the broom and gave the man a wimpy whack before he stood up and tried to grab me. I physically jumped down the stairs and ran down the street to my sister's work like I was going to die. And I thought I was. I ran to the nurse's station and started to have a breakdown. I was crying and almost throwing up, and the nurses looked at me like I was just raped or something. I told them that a man was following me and was going to kill me. They got my sister and called the police. It turned out he was a serial rapist. Me and my sister moved, and she went away to college. It was one of those nights where sleep eluded me, and I found myself aimlessly browsing Craigslist in search of a good deal on a pair of Air Jordan 1s. My sneaker obsession had escalated over the years, and the desire to own a pair of those. However, the steep price had always deterred me. That night, though, as I scrolled through numerous listings, I came across an offer that seemed too good to be true, a brand new pair for just $300, half the usual cost. The listing included several photos showcasing the shoes from different angles. They appeared to be in pristine condition, and my excitement was palpable. Yet, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind urged caution. I spent a while examining the listing, comparing the photos to images of authentic Air Jordan 1s. Everything seemed to match up, but I couldn't find any obvious signs of a scam. Still, a small voice inside me whispered doubts. Despite my apprehension, I decided to message the seller. After a brief exchange, we agreed to meet the following day at a gas station not far from my place. At night, I lay in bed, my gut churning with nervousness. I told myself I was merely being paranoid. The next day, I withdrew the $300 and made my way to the gas station. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy, oppressive atmosphere on the deserted streets. As I leaned against my car, scanning the area, searching for any signs of life, the gas station seemed abandoned, and the silence was deafening. I became more nervous with each passing minute, trying to convince myself that I was just overreacting. Time seemed to crawl by as I waited, my mind racing with countless scenarios of how the exchange could go wrong. Finally, a battered sedan entered the parking lot, and my heart leapt into my throat. The car parked several spots away, and I observed the driver, an untidy man with a greasy beard and unkempt hair. He gestured at me, and I hesitated for a moment before cautiously approaching him, feeling the weight of the cash in my pocket. As I walked over to the man, I scrutinized his appearance and the vehicle. He didn't resemble a sneaker enthusiast or a sneakerhead as we like to call it, and his car seemed out of place with its dark-tinted windows. I couldn't help but think that perhaps this was all a ruse, a carefully orchestrated plan to part me from my money. However, I pushed my concerns aside, desperately wanting to believe that the deal was legitimate. I greet the man, trying to appear casual despite the restlessness knowing me, I said, mustering up a friendly demeanor. He responded with a curt nod, his eyes darting around the parking lot. I handed him the money, and he counted it quickly, his fingers trembling slightly. He then informed me that he'd fetched the shoes from the trunk. He ambled to the back of his car, my anticipation mounting, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched as he fumbled with the keys, seemingly struggling to open the trunk. I recalled, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. My thoughts raced, and a shiver traveled down my spine as I recalled the countless stories I'd heard about sketchy Craigslist deals gone awry. I considered walking away, but the prospect of owning those Air Jordan 1s kept me rooted to the spot. The man finally opened the trunk, revealing a shoebox inside, and relief washed over me. I chided myself for being overly paranoid, but as he reached for the box, his movements became suspiciously hurried. He glanced around nervously before suddenly slamming the trunk shut and sprinting back to the driver's seat. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening before I could react. The car's engine roared to life, and the man darted out of the parking lot, leaving me in a whirlwind of dust and confusion. I recounted, feeling dumbstruck as the harsh reality of the situation dawned on me. I had been swindled out of $300, a mix of rage and humiliation welling up inside me as I cursed myself for being so gullible. I knew I should have trusted my instincts, but it was too late now. As the car disappeared down the road, I was left with nothing but a bruised ego and an empty wallet. As I drove home, replaying the events in my head, the magnitude of my mistake became clear. I should have insisted on more proof, like additional photos or a video call to see the shoes, or even a written agreement. I should have chosen a busier location, like a bustling shopping center or a well-lit parking lot with security cameras. I had ignored so many red flags, blinded by my desire to own those Air Jordan 1s. Over the next few days, I was consumed with disappointment and self-reproach, I confessed, recalling the frustration of reporting the incident to the police, knowing that the likelihood of getting my money back was next to none. I also flagged the seller on Craigslist, determined to prevent anyone else from suffering the same fate. Yet, in spite of my actions, the embarrassment of being duped and scammed continued to haunt me. I shared my story with friends and family, hoping that they'd learn from my experience and be more cautious in their own dealings. I admitted, reflecting on the varied reactions I received. Some offered sympathy, while others couldn't help but chuckle at my misfortune. But I saw it as a new chapter in my life, using the experience as a lesson. Months later, I finally saved up enough money to purchase a pair of Air Jordan 1s from a reputable seller. I concluded, feeling a bittersweet sense of triumph as I held the shoes in my hands. The memory of my ill-fated Craigslist encounter still stung, but I knew that I'd emerge from the experience wiser and more cautious. I promised myself that I'd never let my guard down again, using my hard-learned lesson to help others avoid falling prey to the same trap.